In 1982, Bryan Ferry was untouchable. His band Roxy Music had just released Avalon, the most commercially successful album of their career. It went straight to #1 in the UK. The singles were everywhere. The sound was lush, sophisticated, impossibly cool. Ferry himself had become the living embodiment of British elegance, a man cultural critics said should hang in the Tate Gallery like a work of art. He had sold millions of records, he had a beautiful new wife, he had everything, and then he walked away from the band that built him. What happened next would cost him more than he ever imagined. Because the thing about Bryan Ferry is that the image he spent a lifetime constructing, the perfect suit, the perfect croon, the art-directed existence, it was never just a costume, it was a fortress. And inside that fortress, almost everything was quietly falling apart. But to understand the fall, you have to understand just how unlikely the rise was in the first place.
Bryan Ferry was born on the 26th of September 1945 in Washington, County Durham, a small industrial town in the northeast of England. His father was a farm laborer who also looked after pit ponies in the local coal mines. His mother was a homemaker. There was nothing remotely glamorous about where Ferry came from. As a boy, he raised pigeons in the backyard. He delivered newspapers to earn pocket money, and with those coins he bought jazz magazines, losing himself in a world that felt like it existed on another planet entirely. That gap between where he was and where he wanted to be would define everything that followed. Ferry won a place at Washington Grammar Technical School, where one of his classmates was Howard Kendall, who would later manage Everton Football Club. He achieved 9 O-levels, quietly marking himself as someone with more ambition than his surroundings could contain. But while Kendall drifted towards sport, Ferry was pulled towards something else entirely. He spent a year at Durham University before transferring to study fine art at Newcastle University. And it was there, in 1964, that Ferry walked into the classroom of Richard Hamilton, one of the founding figures of British pop art. That single year under Hamilton would reshape everything. Hamilton would later joke that Ferry was his greatest creation, but that joke contained a real truth. Hamilton did not just teach Ferry about painting or composition. He taught him how to see the world as something that could be designed, curated, controlled. He introduced Ferry to the work of Marcel Duchamp, the French artist whose conceptual provocations had upended the entire idea of what art could be. Ferry absorbed it all. Some of his student paintings were even displayed at the Tate Gallery in 1970. His contemporaries at Newcastle included future artists Tim Head and Nick DeVille, both of whom would later collaborate with Ferry on the visual identity of Roxy Music. Everything Ferry touched, even then, was being filtered through an artistic lens, and that instinct, that obsession with controlling the surface of things, would become both his greatest weapon and his deepest limitation. Because at some point, the line between the art and the person disappears, and when that happens, nobody can tell where the performance ends and the real man begins. After graduating, Ferry briefly worked as a ceramics teacher at a girls' school in London. He lost the job after he started holding impromptu record listening sessions with students instead of teaching the curriculum. He had already been singing in small bands around Newcastle, groups with names like the Banshees and the Gas Board, but none of them went anywhere. At the time, nobody would have looked at Bryan Ferry and predicted what was coming. He was 25 years old, unemployed, and out of options. Then, in 1970, everything changed. Ferry placed an advertisement seeking a keyboardist to collaborate with him, and a bassist he knew from university named Graham Simpson. A saxophonist named Andy Mackay answered the ad. Mackay did not actually play keyboards, but he owned an EMS synthesizer, and, more importantly, he knew someone who did play electronic instruments, a man named Brian Eno. Together, they began assembling what would become Roxy Music. And what nobody realized at the time was that the combination of those two names, Brian and Brian, Ferry and Eno, would create one of the most creatively explosive and personally destructive partnerships in rock history. Roxy Music did not sound like anything else. They did not look like anything else. Ferry, with his slicked-back hair and leopard print jacket, stood at the microphone crooning like a lounge singer from the future. Eno, draped in feathers and glitter, manipulated his synthesizer like a man possessed, producing sounds that seemed to come from a dimension nobody had visited before. The rest of the band, Mackay on saxophone, Phil Manzanera on guitar, Paul Thompson on drums, were all exceptional musicians. But the tension that drove the whole thing
thing forward was the tension between two massive egos who both wanted to be the center of attention. Their self-titled debut album dropped in 1972, and the effect was immediate. The single Virginia Plain stormed the UK charts. The album cover alone, featuring model Carrie-Anne Moeller in a dress designed by Anthony Price, became a cultural event. Music journalist Richard Williams called it nothing less than a challenge, bold and direct, to the prevailing complacency of British rock. Ferry had designed the cover himself. He had art-directed every detail, enlisting friends from art school, including Nick DeVille, to create something that was as visually arresting as it was musically radical. And that combination of visual spectacle and musical innovation made Roxy music an instant sensation in Europe and the UK. One critic noted that they had arrived like uber-glamorous spacemen at Warp Factor 8 from an exoplanet where a particularly brilliant museum curator had been put in charge of a rock band. Nobody had ever seen anything like it, and for a brief, incandescent moment, everything was aligned. Their second album, For Your Pleasure, arrived in 1973 and pushed even further into strange, beautiful territory. Songs like In Every Dream Home a Heartache explored loneliness and eroticism with a sophistication that seemed impossibly ahead of its time. Ferry's girlfriend Amanda Lear, a French singer and model, appeared on the album cover posing alongside a black Jaguar. Lear would later go on to date David Bowie, continuing a pattern of Bryan Ferry's romantic life intersecting with the lives of the biggest rock stars in the world, in ways that never quite worked out in his favor. But even as the music reached new heights, the thing that would tear the band apart was already becoming impossible to ignore. The problem was simple and impossible to solve. Roxy Music was Bryan Ferry's band. He wrote the songs, he shaped the vision, he sang every word. But the press could not stop talking about Brian Eno. Eno was funnier in interviews, more photogenic, more eccentric. Ferry was reserved and tongue-tied with journalists. Eno had confidence in spades, and audiences were starting to treat Eno like the star. At one concert, overzealous Eno fans began shouting so loudly over Ferry's singing that Eno himself walked off stage to try to calm the situation. The band's management made things worse by pushing Ferry to take center stage, deepening the rift. As guitarist Phil Manzanera later recalled, the first time they appeared on Top of the Pops, the only thing you saw of Eno was his glove. If you are finding this story fascinating, consider subscribing because every episode on this channel is a deep dive into the most dramatic stories in music history. By the time they finished their second album, For Your Pleasure, in 1973, the tension had become unbearable. Eno himself later admitted it was a typical clash of young male egos, that the press attention he received distorted the impression of where the creative leadership actually lay. It was definitely Bryan's band, Eno said, but that acknowledgement came too late. In July 1973, Brian Eno left Roxy Music. The band was only big enough for one Brian. Here is what nobody talks about enough. The moment Eno left, Ferry did something extraordinary and slightly reckless. Instead of pausing to regroup, he replaced Eno with an 18-year-old classically trained multi-instrumentalist named Eddie Jobson, and simultaneously launched a solo career. Between 1972 and 1974, Bryan Ferry released 6 studio albums across both projects. 6 albums in 2 years. The productivity was staggering, and the results were remarkable. With Roxy Music, the album Stranded became their first UK #1. Ferry stepped out from behind his keyboard, put on a white dinner jacket designed by Anthony Price, and transformed himself into the most stylish man in British rock. Rolling Stone dubbed him the dandy of the bazaar. Cultural critic Peter York called him the best possible example of the ultimate art-directed existence. Ferry was not just making music, he was making himself into an icon. His solo albums, meanwhile, did something nobody had really done before. These Foolish Things and Another Time, Another Place were albums of cover versions, old standards reinterpreted through Ferry's unique crooning sensibility. The concept was both innovative and nostalgic. A jaunty reading of Elvis Presley's Baby I Don't Care sat alongside a remarkable hit single version of Bob Dylan's A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall. Both albums cracked the UK top 5 and effectively invented a template that would later be followed by Joni Mitchell, Rod Stewart, and even Bob Dylan himself. David Bowie, who released his own covers album Pin-Ups around the same time, called Ferry one of the best lyricists in British music. The two men were constantly being compared, and the competition between them was real. They influenced a generation, not just with their music, but with their appearances. And then there was the live show. When Ferry was finally granted permission to perform at the Royal Albert Hall in December 1974, after initially being denied due to a ban on rock concerts at the venue, the performance confirmed his status as a major icon of the music world. He was not just a singer, he was an event, a spectacle, an experience designed down to the last stitch of his Anthony Price suit. Everything was working. Roxy Music was dominating the UK charts with a trilogy of albums, Stranded, Country Life, and Siren, that broadened their appeal internationally. Ferry reinvented himself on stage, in costumes ranging from gaucho to military uniforms. He was dating the most beautiful women in the world. He had become exactly the person that the boy from Durham had dreamed of becoming. But here is the thing about Roxy Music that almost nobody in America understood at the time. For all their dominance in Europe, they never truly broke through in the States. As guitarist Phil Manzanera later admitted, they were too European to go over big in America. They were not raunchy enough. That failure to conquer the American market would eat at Ferry for years. But the real story was only beginning. In 1975, Ferry began a relationship with Jerry Hall, the stunning Texan model who appeared on the cover of Roxy Music's album Siren. Their romance became one of the most photographed relationships in rock. They lived together in London and Los Angeles. To the outside world, they were the ultimate glamour couple. But in late 1977, Jerry Hall met Mick Jagger, and she left Ferry for him. The devastation was total, and it was public. Ferry's response was to retreat into the studio and pour everything into an album called The Bride Stripped Bare. The title was borrowed from a Marcel Duchamp artwork about the dynamics between men and women, and the music inside was the most emotionally raw thing Ferry had ever recorded. He made it largely alone, during a harsh winter in Montreux, Switzerland. It was the sound of a man coming apart. But here is the cruel twist. The Bride Stripped Bare was released in September 1978, at the absolute peak of the punk rock explosion in Britain. The record was roundly ignored. The singles barely charted. Critic Greil Marcus called it the best album of the year, comparing it to Van Morrison's Astral Weeks. But almost nobody else was listening. After years of unbroken success, Bryan Ferry had experienced something entirely new: failure. What would you have done? Would you have kept pushing forward alone, or gone back to the thing that made you famous? Drop your answer in the comments. Disappointed by the lukewarm response, Ferry made a decision that would shape the rest of his career. He reformed Roxy Music, and the second era of the band would prove to be even more commercially successful than the first. Manifesto arrived in 1979. Flesh and Blood reached #1 in 1980, and then came Avalon in 1982, the album that would become their masterpiece and their farewell. Avalon was everything Ferry had been building toward: smooth, atmospheric, impossibly elegant. It sounded like champagne and heartbreak distilled into sound. The album reached #1 in the UK and became their biggest seller worldwide. More than this, became one of the most recognizable songs of the decade. Their cover of John Lennon's Jealous Guy, released as a tribute after Lennon's murder in December 1980, became their first and only #1 single. By now, Roxy Music had been reduced to a core trio of Ferry, Mackay, and Manzanera, augmented by session musicians. The band that had once been a collision of competing creative forces was now essentially a Bryan Ferry solo project with a famous name attached. And in a way, that was the problem. He had won. There was nobody left to fight, nobody left to push against. The creative tension that had fueled everything since the Eno years was gone. Ferry married London socialite Lucy Helmore in June 1982, a month after Avalon's release. Helmore was only 22. Ferry was 36. Though her face is not seen, she was the model on the album's iconic cover, a silhouette of mystery and beauty. Their first son, Otis, was born 5 months later. To the outside world, this was a man at the absolute summit. But what nobody could see was that the summit was also a cliff edge. After exhausting, debilitating tours to promote Avalon, Ferry disbanded Roxy Music. He walked away from the thing that had defined him. He said he wanted to focus on his solo career, but looking back, it feels more like a man who had achieved perfection and had nowhere left to go.
And that decision would haunt him for decades. Because this is where the fall begins. Not a dramatic crash, but something quieter, something slower, something that might be harder to watch. Ferry's first post-Roxy solo album, Boys and Girls, arrived in 1985 and went straight to #1 in the UK. It contained Slave to Love and Don't Stop the Dance, two of his most beloved solo tracks. He performed at Live Aid, backed by Pink Floyd's David Gilmour, though the performance was plagued by technical disasters. A drumstick broke during the opening song. Gilmour's guitar went dead. The sound was a mess. But the album stayed in the UK charts for nearly a year. To most people, Ferry was still on top. But underneath the surface, things were fracturing. His next albums, Bête Noire in 1987 and Taxi in 1993, both made the UK top 10, but the commercial trajectory was clearly downward. More importantly, something had shifted in music. The culture that had elevated Ferry, that had celebrated his sophistication, his elegance, his distance, was now moving in a different direction. Britpop was rising. Dance music was exploding. The art school cool that had made Ferry a god in the 70s and early 80s was starting to feel like a relic, and his personal life was unraveling in ways the public would not fully understand for years. His marriage to Lucy Helmore, which had produced 4 sons, Otis, Isaac, Tara, and Merlin, ended in divorce in 2003 after 21 years. Helmore struggled with depression, substance dependency, and alcoholism for years. She attended recovery programs. She eventually remarried, but she never fully escaped the darkness. In 2018, Lucy Helmore died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound while on holiday in Ireland. Her brother described it as the end of a long battle with depression. Ferry said he was saddened and shocked. Think about that for a moment. The woman on the cover of Avalon, the album that represented the pinnacle of everything Ferry had built, was fighting a private war that nobody could see. Sometimes the most beautiful surfaces are hiding the deepest fractures. And the man who had spent his entire career perfecting surfaces may have understood that better than anyone, and still been powerless to stop it. In 2007, Ferry's career took another devastating hit, but this time it was entirely self-inflicted. In an interview with the German newspaper Welt am Sonntag, Ferry praised the iconography of Nazi Germany, calling the films of Leni Riefenstahl and the architecture of Albert Speer just fantastic and really beautiful. He reportedly referred to his own recording studio as the Führer bunker. The backlash was immediate and severe. Jewish leaders condemned the remarks. A member of the British Parliament introduced a motion calling for a boycott of Ferry's recordings and performances. His modeling contract with Marks & Spencer came under intense scrutiny. Ferry issued a full apology, saying the comments were made solely from an art history perspective, but the damage was done. For a man who had spent his entire career carefully constructing an image of refined sophistication, it was a catastrophic lapse of judgment. If this story is making you think about the price of fame and the weight of legacy, hit the like button because that tells us you want more stories like this. The years that followed were a slow fade. Ferry continued to release albums, each one landing a little lower on the charts than the last. He released Mamouna in 1994, which made the UK top 11, but failed to generate any significant cultural conversation. In 1999, he released As Time Goes By, an album of 30s and 40s standards that felt like a retreat into a past that was not even his own. And then, perhaps sensing that the only way forward was backward, he did something that surprised everyone. In 2001, Ferry reformed Roxy Music for a 30th anniversary tour. Manzanera, McKay, and Thompson all returned. The tours were extensive and profitable. But Brian Eno was notably absent, and when asked about the reunion, he said simply that he did not like the idea, that it left a bad taste. Although Eno later said his comment had been taken out of context, and although he contributed a track to Ferry's 2002 solo album Frantic, the fact remained that the two Bryans had never fully reconciled. The band Roxy Music could be reassembled, but the creative chemistry that had made them revolutionary could not. Olympia, released in 2010, featured an extraordinary roster of collaborators including Nile Rodgers, David Gilmour, members of Scissor Sisters and Groove Armada, and had supermodel Kate Moss on the cover. Despite all of that star power, it barely made the UK top 20 and fell out of the charts after 3 weeks. The Jazz Age, released in 2012 as a collection of 20-style jazz renditions of Ferry's catalog, peaked at number 50 on the UK albums chart. It was the lowest chart position of Ferry's entire career. Director Baz Luhrmann used material from the album in The Great Gatsby, which gave Ferry a brief moment of cultural relevance. But it was relevance by association, not by creation. His personal life continued to generate tabloid headlines for all the wrong reasons. In 2009, he began a relationship with Amanda Shepard, a former PR executive who was 37 years his junior. The added complication was that Shepard had previously dated Ferry's own son, Isaac. They married in January 2012 in a private beachfront ceremony in Turks and Caicos. 19 months later, they separated. The divorce was finalized in 2014, with Shepard citing unreasonable behavior. And then there was the near tragedy. In 2000, the entire Ferry family had been aboard British Airways Flight 2069 to Nairobi when a passenger forced his way into the cockpit and attacked the pilot. The plane plunged 12,000 feet in 25 seconds, the fastest rate of descent from which any civil aircraft has ever recovered. Everyone survived. But in December 2014, Ferry's youngest son Merlin was cut from the wreckage of a three-car collision, suffering multiple fractures and a head injury. The recovery was long and painful. So here is Bryan Ferry, the miner's son from County Durham who reinvented himself as the most elegant man in rock and roll, the art student who treated his entire life as a design project, the band leader who pushed out the only person who might have been his creative equal because there was only room for one visionary, the romantic who lost Jerry Hall to Mick Jagger and poured that heartbreak into an album the world ignored. The icon whose carefully constructed image could not protect his first wife from depression, could not prevent a 19-month marriage to his son's ex-girlfriend from collapsing, and could not stop him from saying something in a German newspaper that nearly ended his career. But this is not a story that ends in ruins. That is what makes it complicated. In 2019, Roxy Music were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Duran Duran's Simon Le Bon, a man who would not exist as an artist without Ferry's influence, described Ferry's lyrics as open heart surgery. Rolling Stone had already ranked Roxy Music at number 98 on their list of the greatest artists of all time. In 2023, Ferry was ranked at number 150 on Rolling Stone's list of the 200 greatest singers of all time. Kate Bush once said Ferry was the most exciting singer she had ever heard, that his voice covered the whole emotional spectrum. Over 30 million albums sold worldwide. A CBE from the Queen. The French Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. An honorary doctorate from Newcastle University, the same institution where Richard Hamilton once taught him to see the world as art. Bryan Ferry is still touring, still performing in impeccable suits, still delivering that elegant, seductive croon that has no real vocal antecedent. The Village Voice once wrote that his voice operates on the same principle as hotel room service, that studied effects appear with hazy origins, use themselves up, and are removed without explanation. Nobody has ever quite figured out how to describe what Ferry does with his voice. And maybe that is because what he does is not really singing in the traditional sense. It is inhabiting a character so completely that the line between the voice and the man becomes invisible. He is approaching his 81st birthday as a man who never quite reached the heights in America that he deserved, who never fully escaped the shadow of the band he disbanded, and who never stopped trying to control every detail of a life that kept refusing to be controlled. The thing about Bryan Ferry is that his greatest creation was never a song or an album or even Roxy Music itself. His greatest creation was Bryan Ferry, the character, the image, the art-directed existence. He built himself from nothing, from pigeons and pit ponies and newspaper rounds, into something that cultural critics compared to a living painting. But the cost of maintaining that illusion, of keeping every surface polished while everything beneath it churned, was enormous. He lost collaborators, lovers, wives, and public goodwill, not because he lacked talent, but because the same perfectionism and control that made him extraordinary also made him impossible to live with, impossible to partner with, and sometimes impossible to forgive. And maybe that is the real story of Bryan Ferry. Not a rise and fall at all, but a rise and a slow, elegant, immaculately dressed erosion. A man who proved that you can design every detail of your existence and still find that life refuses to follow the blueprint. A man who built a fortress out of style and discovered too late that a fortress keeps everyone out, including the people you need most. That is the tragedy of Bryan Ferry. Not that he fell, but that he never stopped performing long enough to let anyone catch him.